Hello everyone, welcome back. I guess we'll start now. I'd like to introduce our second panel, which will discuss socio-economic changes and continuities. And the chairperson for this panel is Dr. Amitendu Palit. He is a senior research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS, and also head of its Partnerships and Programs Division. Dr. Amitendu Palit is an economist specializing in comparative economic studies, political economy of international trade, regional developments, and public policies. His current research is on China-India comparative economic development, trade, and regional architectures in the Asia-Pacific and political economy of economic reforms, and he has written numerous books and articles on these in these areas. Thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Palit for being here, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the conference. Probably, as the saying goes, much cliched as it is, the toughest session is always the one after lunch. So we'll try to live up to the challenge. I'll spend the 1 minute that I have allotted to me in giving an introduction to the panel by purely focusing on housekeeping rules. And this is following a short conversation that I had with Professor Hudson during the lunch break, that in the interest of allowing more engagement from the participants in terms of questions and comments, we just thought it would be great if if these presentations can be limited to 25 minutes instead of 30 minutes. The whole dynamic is expected to change. Oh no, it's not expected to change. I was hoping that the third speaker, yeah, well, so 25 minutes each, and we would be happy to utilize the time that we get as a result of that economy of expression by getting more questions and comments. So let me straight away proceed on the introduction of our first panelist. Fadhel Kaboub is going to be the first speaker. He's Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University and President of the Binzar Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Kaboub's research focuses on the political economy of the Middle East and on job creation programs to address youth unemployment in the region. He's a widely published author, and his recent work has been presented at many prestigious institutions, including the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Harvard Law School, Cornell University, and Columbia University. Some of his recent media commentaries on employment, development, finance, and the Middle East economies have appeared in the Financial Times, Al-Ahram Weekly, Radio France International, National Public Radio, Saudi Gazette, Business First, La Quotidienne, and La Presse. Kaboub is currently writing a book on the political economy of the Arab uprisings, and he's going to speak on institutional change after the 2011 Arab uprisings. Fadhel.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to try to keep up with the time constraint that I've been given. It's my pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and your participation in this fantastic event so far, from the first few panels and the conversations over lunch and dinner last night. I'm gonna butcher the first few slides in a very significant way, in the interest of time. Speculating on the root causes of the Arab uprisings, the 2011 uprisings, I'm going to do the 1 minute review very quickly as an introduction. So the pre-uprisings economics, or what I call the road to TINA, there is no alternative. This is Margaret Thatcher's TINA. You have post-independence, state-led economic development policies, followed by import substitution industrialization and socialist experiments in the 1960s, especially Tunisia and Egypt that I'll focus on today. followed by the opening up or an infitah period, export-led economic growth period in the 1970s. The idea was that if you open up and industrialize and drive your economy through exports, most of the other problems will go away eventually. What we've discovered very briefly here is that if you're not fully industrialized and you open up your economy to international trade and try to accelerate exports, you end up accelerating imports at an even faster rate, which led to eventually the debt crisis of the 1980s, the intervention of the World Bank with structural adjustment policies in the 1990s, implementing essentially the neoliberal reforms of privatizing state-owned enterprises, focusing on foreign direct investment, eventually liberalizing exchange rate policies. And then the 2000s, especially in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, is what I call and I'm supposed to be clicking these. In the year 2000s is what I call the presidential plutocracy system, where in Tunisia, for example, similar things happen in Egypt. It was the president's office and the president's family and the inner circle of the palace that really took advantage of the privatization of state-owned enterprises and built essentially a business empire in a very short amount of time that was very visible to the rest of the population. So it wasn't a hidden kind of takeover of the economy. In the pre-uprising let's see, am I on the same page here? In the pre-uprisings period, what you've experienced in terms of the population's experience in this period is a collective sense of exclusion, oppression, and humiliation, high youth unemployment, and again, I'll be as careful as the previous speakers not to say that this is really what caused the uprisings, but it's definitely a factor. In the case of Tunisia in particular, there was a sense that there was no hope for internal transformation, political transformation, or external pressure to change the regime or to open up the system a little bit. And I've written extensively on this, and I'll be happy to share the details, but in the interest of time, again, I'm not going to focus on this. I'll try to focus more on the alternative economic development plan that I'm proposing here. And essentially, there was a sense that there was not much to lose. And this was something that built up in Tunisia and Egypt, not in 2010 and 2011, but it really started in the early 2000s with several events, culminating in protests by workers, by farmers, environmentalists in the case of Tunisia, the Kifaya movement in Egypt, the equivalent of it in Tunis was called Yizzi Fuk, which also means Kifaya, kind of enough already movement. So all of these social movements that started building had nothing to do with Twitter and Facebook and all that stuff that the media picked up on in 2010, 2011. So there's a variety of strands that really led to the uprisings. The assessment of the uprisings, and here I'm going to again do the quick 1 minute review, which we can debate. For Tunisia, with all the things that happened in the last few years, I want to say I'm cautiously optimistic that on the political front, at least, there's a possibility of a successful transition. But I'm going to be again, I'm speculating here. It's in a much better place than Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and the rest of the list there. On the economic front, and I'm going to generalize this statement to essentially all the countries on this list. Unfortunately, we're still using the same economic philosophy, the same economic model, under slightly different labels with the help of some of our friends around the world. And I'm going to try to challenge that in my presentation today. Egypt, well, we've just heard the preliminary results of the elections. It looks like Sisi, surprise, won. So on the political front, it's really more of the same, I think. Libya, there's no really formal state in place. It's still in flux, and it's sort of a civil war type of situation. Yemen, again, very, very unstable political system with heavy intervention from Saudi Arabia to stabilize the situation based on its interest. Qatar, from what I understand, is also trying to do the same. Syria, I don't think I need to share any news here about the civil war context. It's devastating. And Bahrain, for a variety of reasons that I'll try to skip here, is still in the same situation, despite, at some point having more than 50% of the population on the streets protesting, and yet some of the media outlets, including Al Jazeera, decides that it's worth just a brief mention, not full coverage 24/7. The post-uprising situation in Tunisia and in Egypt in particular, it's very clearly a triumph of there is no alternative. We're going to focus on the same economic development policies of the 1990s and the 2000s, which I'll review in a few slides. I want to highlight one of the key demands of the protesters in Tunisia and Libya and in Egypt. It's the concept of dignity, Karama in Arabic. And just to highlight the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what we mean by dignity, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So the question that I want to focus on, trying to assess the uprisings and trying to look at reforms and economic plans for the future, is the following. What is the legal, political, and socioeconomic system that can ensure life with dignity? And I stated it earlier in my comments this morning, but it's really the most fundamental thing that I think the protesters were demanding in Tunisia and Egypt and in other parts of the Arab world. Jobs is what I believe is a fundamental component of delivering life with dignity, access to jobs that pay a decent wage, provide access to education, access to stable middle-class status, fulfilling work environment, dignified work environment is really the proposal that I would like to share with you today. The role of institutions is something that constantly comes back to the discussions, especially from the World Bank and the IMF. And here I want to state something in a very clear terms, what I mean by institutions and what some mainstream economists mean by institutions are very different things. And I mean, by institutions, I don't mean organizations. I mean the socio-cultural habits of thought and routines of behavior that are deeply embedded in a community's collective experiences. So these are cultural institutions, not just rules and regulations and constitutions. And I'm listing here a whole bunch of components that really enrich the fabric of society and the culture that we're dealing with and that I describe as institutions. Now, when the World Bank talks about institutions and the importance of institutions, they have a very specific thing in mind. And the neoliberal approach to institutions, it's the free market capitalist institutions. It's Friedman's pillars of free market capitalism: private property, freedom of choice, free and fair competition, self-interest, and then ready, set, go, the market will thrive, right? So here I'm really not dealing with that very specific kind of institutional framework that's usually referred to in the literature, including after the uprisings. So we're trying to deal with institutional change, very complicated type of institutional change. Institutions, the cultural institutions that I talk about here, are not eternal, but they cannot be easily disposed of either. They do change slowly over time in an evolutionary way rather than an abrupt kind of shock therapy type of manner. So popular uprisings, demands for freedom of speech, new constitutions, transparent elections, all of these things by themselves cannot bring about institutional change. We're dealing with a much more complicated process. As I described it this morning, I'm thinking of, you're driving a car and you're trying to fix it at the same time, and you're trying to fix a lot of parts at the same time. And all of these parts are interconnected, and this is really what the fabric of society is all about. It's not just the economic, it's not just the legal, it's not just the political, elections system, it's all the above. And it's the police reform and justice reform, and all of these things have to adjust at the same time. And you can't change the mindset of the police force, for example, in Tunisia or in Egypt, from a police force that's been trained and designed and built on the principle of protecting the state, not protecting the institutions and the rule of law, not protecting the citizens. It's protecting the government from the people, from any outside force. And when you're trying to transition to a new system, you're not going to overnight retrain the entire police force and reintroduce a new philosophy of view of the world very easily. And imagine this kind of transformation happening across the entire system. I'm not trying to say that it will never happen, that it's impossible, but we have to be aware of the challenges that we've been facing in the last few years and that we'll continue to face into the future. So it's not an easy process. I'm aware of the challenges. However, I still would like to present an alternative, and I would like to argue that there is a real alternative, a TIARA of some sort instead of TINA. I want to highlight some of the advantages that we have, some of the assets that have been created and accomplished and that we should focus on instead of just focusing on the negative effects, but also highlight the challenges. The advantages we have, grassroots momentum is fantastic for driving the process of social transformation, political transformation. But again, if we don't capitalize on these gains very quickly, that momentum will disappear and will turn into a counterproductive force. We have a more open and engaged civil discourse, which is again a very important asset to capitalize on. But unfortunately, we're losing some of this momentum and turning into more despair and kind of withdrawal from some of the young people who were part of the uprisings. Focusing on domestic and regional resources. This is not rocket science. Really focusing on our internal resources, especially labor resources, internally within a country, but also within the region through cooperation and collaboration. A young labor force is often seen in the Middle East as a problem because of the youth bulge and the unemployment. But also let's think of it as a resource, as a fantastic resource that a lot of countries, advanced countries, would like to have. Then education, I have it on both lists as an advantage, but also I have to be very specific about the educational system reform. In terms of challenges, security and economic uncertainty is overwhelming in the case of Libya, for example, in the case of even Tunisia and Egypt, especially when you have an economic system that's built on tourism, that's built on foreign direct investment. If you're a local investor or a foreign investor, one of the first things you'd like to know before you put your money in irreversible capital investment is what is the tax system going to be like? What is the interest rate going to be like? What's the inflation rate going to be like? What is the private property laws? What are they going to look like in 3 years and 5 years and 10 years? And until you provide that very specific predictable economic and political environment, you're not going to see massive inflow of foreign direct investment in the region. Lack of financial sovereignty is something that I'd like to highlight today, especially following the previous panel's discussion on the role of trade deficits in the region. And what I mean by financial sovereignty, or the lack of financial sovereignty, I'm talking about countries who have been put in a position to borrow in international financial markets, to borrow and promise to pay back in foreign currencies. So I'm going to make a distinction between the national debt, which is denominated in the local currency, versus the external debt, which is denominated in foreign currencies. And the problem that we have in the case of Egypt, in the case of Tunisia, is this chronic trade deficit problem that's driven primarily by food trade deficit and energy deficit. I'm not talking about the Gulf countries here, I'm talking about the non-oil exporting countries. How do you fill the gap? Well, you either try to export your way out of the crisis, which hasn't been happening since the 1970s. If anything, the external debt has been accumulating even further. If you don't do anything about it, your exchange rate will devalue, which means the next day you go out trying to buy wheat or energy from the international markets, you'll be importing it at a much higher cost, and you'll be importing inflation. And you'll be importing social unrest if bread and the cost of energy is increasing. As a result, as a government, what you have to do to prevent that increase in the cost of living is to subsidize bread and subsidize energy. And then you keep going with the same cycle. So the problem that I'd like to highlight here is that if you have an exchange rate problem, an external debt problem, that's not going to go away because you have a structural problem. Your only solution in the long run is a food policy, an agricultural policy, an environmental policy, an energy policy. Otherwise, the problem is still going to perpetuate itself forever. So that's one of the main things that I want to highlight here. And once you lose your financial sovereignty, once you are put in a position to accumulate external debt, there's no way you're going to ever pay back that external debt unless you're able to attract massive foreign direct investment, massive stock market flows into your domestic economy, which a lot of emerging countries have experienced, massive inflow, and then speculators leave, and you have an even bigger problem. Remittances from foreign workers, from expats, and you can't completely rely on that. Even Lebanon, which is one of the countries that receives the most, I think, for its GDP, is not sufficient. In addition to that, most of these countries that have trade deficits, they have to build that buffer of foreign reserves. And it's misleading. We call it foreign reserves as if it's a surplus. It's not a surplus. It's kind of a defensive measure as a last resort to protect the economy from those fluctuations. In addition to those reserves, you still have to borrow to finance that trade deficit. So the direction in which we should be focusing our attention as a long-term solution is really addressing the root causes of those trade deficits. Energy policy, agricultural policy are absolutely crucial. And we're at a time technological where the solutions are within reach, especially for a region that has access to solar power. And solar technology is becoming increasingly accessible and affordable. It's a no-brainer that this is where the massive investments should be going to. This is where the employment policy should be directed to. This is where technical training and vocational training should be directed to. And that brings me to the vocational training deficit. For decades in the Middle East, in Tunisia in particular, where I grew up, the focus has been on higher education, more higher education, more higher education, and at the same time, creating this very negative stigma for vocational training. High school dropouts, designated as losers in society. And you get to a point today where in Tunisia, foreign investors will say, well, we'll be happy to relocate and open shop. You have all of these advantages. The problem is we'll hire maybe one or two accountants, a couple of managers, a couple of secretaries, but we need machinists, we need people who fix the plumbing, we need people who know how to do electricity, and just the skills are not there. And it's a serious long-term problem that we have to address. And then after the uprising, for good reasons, there's this collective phobia from bold government actions. So when we're trying to propose long-term policies to restructure the economy, to focus on long-term solutions, there's a fear that this is, again, big government taking over and trying to, reintroduce the same kind of corrupt, massive control of the economy of society. So that's also another challenge. And I realize that I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go quickly to some of the data here. This is 5 minutes. Thank you. This is Tunisia's trade balance. You can immediately tell where the opening happened. The data here stops in the year 2000, but the graph keeps going in the same direction, doubles that level. So there's a serious gap there that needs to be filled. Egypt's trade balance is not better, and it's not getting any better. And these are where the structural problems happen. And the reverse of those images is the external debt. And here I'm specifically showing external debt as a percentage of export revenues as opposed to GDP, because I'm focusing on the external debt, the dollar-denominated debt, as opposed to the domestic debt, which can be managed through other mechanisms, which I'll not discuss right now. In terms of food deficits, I wanted to highlight this for some of the Arab countries. Even though Egypt here in this picture looks like it's doing great, but you have to keep in mind that Egypt is the #1 importer of wheat in the world. And you don't have to spend a lot of time in the Middle East before you realize that we do consume a lot of wheat and pasta and bread and that kind of stuff. And the numbers are just staggering in terms of where we are. So I'm going to try to, unfortunately, rush through my proposal here, but I'll be happy to share papers and discuss it some more. Restoring financial sovereignty, ultimately you have to restore trade surplus, and as we discussed this morning, this is impossible. We can't be all export-oriented economies on the planet unless we find a different planet and we trade with them and we all become export-oriented on planet Earth and some other planet has a trade deficit. So this is not a global solution, and it's not going to work for countries that have that structural deficiency. Increased tourism, yeah, it's nice, but it's not working. Foreign direct investment, most of it goes to countries that have the massive public infrastructure. China and India are successful in that regard. A lot of foreign direct investment goes between Germany and the US and Canada and Norway, not towards developing countries. It's really insignificant. Workers' remittances, you can't really design macroeconomic policy for a nation based on individual remittances. It's helpful, but it's not a solution. Privatized state-owned enterprises, we've done that and we know the results. Liberalized financial markets, you're essentially attracting speculators. You're not attracting, you don't have Wall Street or London to have that stable kind of flow of capital. Foreign aid and charity, sure, it works if you want to rely on that, but it's not dependable. Debt swap solutions have worked on very small scale. UNESCO did that for a while for some of the HIPIX countries, the highly indebted poor countries, but again, it's not a global solution. Debt cancellation, it's possible if you have the political clout to enforce it. If you're the US and you would like to cancel the Iraqi debt after 2003 and have James Baker fly around the world and convince Eastern European countries that Iraq will not pay, then you can do that. But otherwise, you're not going to be able to do it. It's an international law doctrine that's been applied before, but and there's a movement in Tunisia, a movement in Egypt to recall some of that debt, but it's not, again, it doesn't have the political clout to enforce it. As a last resort, you default and you face international trade isolations and serious consequences. So you can't really rely on the existing mechanisms to restore your full financial sovereignty. It has to be done internally with your own resources, labor resources, and ideally with partnership, South-South type of trade partnerships as opposed to competition. The job guarantee program that I'm proposing here is inspired by the work of Hyman Minsky, Keynesian economist, who essentially focused on having the government, through community organizations, fund direct job creation. And this is a decentralized system. The funding would come from the government. The funding could come even from private sector or international grants, but the selection of the projects, the implementation of the projects will be done at the local community level. So neighborhood by neighborhood, you'll decide what are the needs of the local community, and at the same time, you try to match the skills of the local unemployed population and design through entrepreneurial decision-making, collective decision-making, design the kinds of jobs that you want to create locally. I'm not going to go through the rest of the slides. I'll continue describing, and I'll stop in 1 minute. So you have community organizations selecting the projects that the community will benefit from through a grassroots movement, decide if we have the local skills to achieve those projects, and create essentially a flexible pool of employment that's based in the local community but funded through a sovereign government. And what you're trying to do is design a system where you have continuous full employment. So you have employment-led growth. So you have the private sector doing its own thing, sometimes hiring, sometimes firing, going through the business cycle. You have the mainline government sector focusing on what we consider as a society to be mainline government employment programs. And then we have the community-based that are more micro-level type of projects that will be different from village to village, from town to town, that try to capitalize on the existing skills of the unemployed in the local community and leverage those for productive projects that will not compete with the private sector. So you're not trying to build cars and produce things that the private sector is already producing, but you're trying to focus on things that are either not supplied by the private sector, goods and services that are not supplied by the private sector, or are undersupplied or are unaffordable for the local community. Examples of these, unfortunately, don't exist in the full sense of the term, but we have experiences with smaller projects, smaller job guarantee systems that have been put in place, especially in Argentina after the 2000 crisis. The Jefes program, which was a head of household employment program, was introduced as an emergency limited type of program and was eventually phased out because it was too successful in building grassroots participation, and those who were socially and economically excluded from the mainstream process became politically active and therefore dangerous for the system, and the business community decided to send them home with welfare checks and please don't participate and don't join the system. India has a smaller, limited experience guaranteeing 100 days of employment for farmers, but again, it's limited in terms of the number of days and the number of hours that you can participate, and none of these programs provided a living wage. So my research program, and I'm hoping that in a few weeks, in Saudi Arabia at least, the Chamber of Commerce in Jeddah is very interested in actually funding a local program, not funded by the government, but funded by private businesses, because they want to see if the mechanics of the program can work. Then they can deal with the finances either through the private sector or through the government or through international grants, and hopefully replicate the experiment in other areas. None of this is a cookie-cutter approach. The design is going to be local, community-based, and the jobs will be created by local community groups. And with this, I'll answer questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. The second panelist to follow, Jillian Schwedler. She's professor of political science at the CUNY, the City University of New York, Hunter College, and the Graduate Center. She is author of the award-winning Faith in Moderation: Islamist Parties in Jordan and Yemen, and more recently, co-editor of Policing and Prisons in the Middle East. Her articles have appeared in World Politics, Comparative Politics, Middle East Policy, Middle East Report, Journal of Democracy, and Social Movement Studies, among others. She's a member of the editorial committee and former chair of the board of directors of the Middle East Research and Information Project, who are the publishers of the Middle East Report. She has been researching in Jordan, Yemen, and Egypt, and has been traveling extensively throughout the Middle East region with support from the National Science Foundation, the US Institute of Peace, the Fulbright Scholars Program, and the Social Science Research Council. And she's currently finishing a book titled Protesting Jordan, Space, Law, Dissent, which examines political protests and policing in the Hashemite Kingdom from 1946 to the present. And today she's going to speak on what is participation, rethinking protest before, during, and after the Arab uprisings. Thank you, Jillian.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone, the organizers especially, for inviting me, and all of you for being here, fighting your food coma after lunch. I'm standing up, so hopefully that will help me fight my food coma as well. My paper covers a lot of ground, which I'm not going to attempt to cover all of it today. So I want to pick out a few pieces of the paper, and particularly how they engage the central theme of the conference. And I did a little adjusting this morning in some ways to sort of engage, in the spirit of conversation, engage with some of the earlier papers today. And I love my colleagues, your last comments was this, please don't participate, which is actually something that's really important that we see in a lot of places where the invitation to participate means do what we want you to do, but don't engage in ways that, you know, threaten us or challenge us too much. So I'm looking at this question of participation before, during, and after the uprisings, and I'm only going to talk briefly about the before and after comparisons because I want to talk about some general themes that don't get talked about, I think, quite frequently. In the spirit of the invitation to disagree with each other, I'm going to start out by saying why I don't think we should look at cases as nation states, as cases, and compare what's happening in countries from nation to nation. Then I'm going to talk about what participation means. Then I'm going to raise a lens of political geography to think about exclusion as a starting point before we think about participation. And finally, I'm going to conclude with why any of this is something we should care about. So what's my critique of the sort of comparing countries as indicators of anything? Well, I mean, the short critique is obviously a lot gets lost. We sort of lump what happens in Jordan as a case of X and Egypt as a case of Y. Whether we're looking at politics or economics, we come up with nation-level indicators and compare them across cases. I'm not suggesting this is a fruitless avenue of research. I think it's useful in very many ways. But it so dominates the way we think that variations within cases just get lost. And so if you're thinking about the Arab uprisings, for example, you have one column of revolutions and cases that had no revolutions. In the cases of revolutions, you have which ones were successful and which ones were not successful. On one level, those characterizations are true. But on another sense, there's no country in the Middle East that didn't have some kind of protests or government responses to the protests, to the uprisings. Some of them escalated to national scale, many of them didn't. But sort of, you know, breaking into those that did and those that didn't, I think does damage to our understanding of the complexities of many of these processes, which I want to draw attention to. So instead of thinking at these sort of nation-level comparisons, I want to instead broader discussion to think about different kinds of comparisons and use different lenses to think about comparisons. So, for example, in thinking of the theme of the conference, challenges and solutions, I'd like to think through microprocesses, very localized politics, variations within regimes. Much of the studies of the uprisings has been what I would call too Tahrir-centric. So just taking the case of Egypt, it's all about Tahrir, when in fact it was about inhabiting multiple public spaces around Egypt. But we just talk about Tahrir as if there was a one dynamic that characterized what was happening in one space, and that becomes the sort of stand-in for the entire nation. And so I would like us to think about variations across cases, and as a broader research plea, we need to get out of the cities more. We know a lot about cities because they're nice places for us to live and inhabit and do our research, and people talk to us. We have great contacts, and there's so much happening outside of cities that I think we are just not attending to, and we really should try to unpack. So I'm going to leave that longer critique. I think I've kind of made my general point. So second part is, participation. Why think of participation? In one way, I want to start with this idea of participation because there's this idea that before the uprisings, there wasn't a whole lot of participation, and those who did try to participate were crushed, and those who did, and many just didn't even try to participate. And then you had this burst of participation where everyone was out there. Again, in one sense, that's somewhat, accurate, but not really, because the protests didn't start out of the middle of nowhere. We didn't know exactly when they were going to escalate, but in the cases where there was a lot of protests, like Egypt, there was actually a long building up trajectory. Even Tunisia, which a lot of people suggest was a case where nothing was going on, there's a book manuscript which I know, so I can tell you about it, but about several years prior to the Tunisian Revolution, where there were different ways that people were trying to demonstrate and express critiques. So one of them were these white protests, where everyone would show up on Boulevard Bourguiba wearing white for a 2 or 3 hour period and do nothing but sit in the coffee shops. But it became really contentious. And so if you're looking carefully, you can actually see these kinds of processes out there. Again, they don't predict the uprisings, but it complicates this before there was nothing going on, and afterwards suddenly everybody was out in the street participating. It complicates that kind of narrative. So participation, we also often think of as a political participation on the one hand in institutional politics. So that's like elections, assemblies, et cetera, very clear forms of participation. And then protests and street kind of demonstrations are often not considered institutional participation. It's extra institutional participation. And I want to push back against that notion in the United States, in the West, as well as in some of the Arab countries, where laws allow protests. There's legal prescriptions for what kinds of protests you can have. There's always a tension where the regimes are trying to limit the boundaries of that. But there are ways in which you can protest legally without inviting too much state repression. And again, there's tension over those boundaries. But protest is an institutionalized form of participation where the law provides for it. So I want us to sort of broaden our scope and not dismiss it as episodic or more contentious in some ways. Sometimes protests are highly contentious. Sometimes protests aren't contentious at all. And in Jordan, so I'm going to use a lot of examples from Jordan because it's my current book project, but you can have 10,000 people in a Haq al-Auda protest and nobody cares except that they'll stop traffic for you. But 200 people in a certain traffic circle invites riot police and eventually one person dies. So why? What explains why a mass of 10,000 people is not threatening and 200 people over here are threatening? So protests are not all equally contentious, and that's one of the things I want to push towards. Even in the midst of protests, these sort of acts on the street, people are participating for different reasons and in different ways. So this will be familiar if you've been to any protest, but often the front line where the cameras are the people that are chanting and have the placards. And if it's a march or you get sort of back to the end, people are milling about. They're talking about they need to shop on the way home or they got out of work to be here. Often they're there because they've been told to be there. They're head of their union or somebody, professional associations sent out a text, this happens very frequently in Jordan, to, for example, the Professional Association of Engineers, said there's a protest at this time and people will go because they were told to go and they want to be seen as having gone. So what that means to participate in that sense, again, it varies very broadly. We also think about economic participation, obviously, participating in forms of economic development. But I really want to go beyond this binary of thinking political participation over here is different from economic participation over here, because I think not only are there interactions, but in fact they're hardly ever separated. The political and the economic are hardly ever separated, and we produce this binary in our academic work in ways that mask the sort of interconnectedness of those two realms. And I'm going to hopefully illustrate that quite literally today. So I want to think about different kinds of participations, not only in both economic and political spheres, but there's different visions for what the Middle East could be, or what each regime could be, or what the futures look like. And there's always multiple visions circulating at a certain time. The state will have its vision. It'll say this is what we're going to do, and here's the policies and how we're going to get there. There are explicit challenger visions. There are visions of the subaltern within the dominant vision, how they'll challenge, and I'm going to try to illustrate this some explicitly. But these visions are sometimes overlapping and sometimes in conflict. And so instead of thinking of, a set of policies here or a set of policies there, think of sort of trajectories for what could be. And participating means in some ways buying into a particular vision of where things could go. Again, I have lots of examples of these that I won't have time to go into, but I want to get to my third point, which I think is the different one. And this has to do with the role of public space. So I want to start here by bracketing this whole question of participation and think of kind of the flip side of participation, which has to do with exclusions, right? Not being invited, not being permitted to be in a particular place or engage in a particular set of processes, or as my colleague says, thank you for not participating, please, it's sort of like, show up and vote every 4 years, but don't, do anything else, because that's a nice, safe form of participation. And again, I'm trying to emphasize through this, and I'll mention at certain points, I'm trying to challenge the notion that there's something fundamentally different in these processes in places like the Middle East or the developing world from the developed or industrialized world. And a lot of them are not just similar, but identical processes. That's not to say it's all the same. Obviously, there's significant differences, particularly in power relations between different parts of the global world. But I want to draw attention to some of these similarities. So I want to start by looking, so these mostly are Jordan, and I don't have long slides of text that I can read back to you, so just lots of pictures. So this is an image of Wakalat Street in Amman, which is a pedestrian mall. So these spaces are really interesting, and these are something that are emerging throughout the United States, throughout the world. It's privatization of public spaces that are still public. So the public has access to these spaces. But in fact, they're private, they're not public, and they very frequently have private security firms controlling and monitoring who can go in and go out. And while anyone can go in, within reason, people also learn whether you're welcome to be there or not. You come to understand whether you're the one that's supposed to be there or not. So this is an image of early on after the mall opened, and this is the idealized image, of course, right? Shopping, right? There's a consumer participation here. You're welcome to shop and particularly hang out and have coffee that costs $4 or whatever. So here's another image of a less crowded day. But I want you to look carefully at this image and this one which was taken just a few months after it. And what's different? What's missing? All the benches have been removed. Why have the benches been removed? Because people were coming and sitting on them. Now, sitting on benches are fine, but if it's the wrong kind of citizen, that is the people that aren't spending money sitting on those benches, they learn they're not welcome. And this is something we learn, in our lives as well. You learn what kinds of spaces you fit in and what kinds you don't. These are very real kinds of exclusions. They're not aimed at excluding per se, they're aimed at building a certain vision. This is where you think of what a vision, a certain kind of public space, a certain kind of public, a certain kind of citizen. But people know there's no mistake about if you're welcome, if you're a part of this vision or not. Malls are very similar in this regard, particularly after the mall bombings, but even before, there's security in malls, and so you just simply have to go through metal detector. If you're a woman, you can get through quite easily. If you're 4 or 5 young men, 15 to 20 years old, you are not welcome. Again, it's a public space, but it's not really a public space. It's a private space. It's privately securitized. This matters significantly for your protests and public participation because as public spaces are privatized, they're differentially available to people to be in them. This is a model of the Abdali project in Amman, which is a massive redevelopment project. Built the very northern part there, which you can see, western part where the tallest skyscrapers are, was the site of the old Mukhabarat building in Amman. So this is under construction. It hasn't been completed, but down the center is a massive pedestrian mall. Again, a private space. You're welcome if you can come and buy an expensive coffee, but if you're too Islamic looking, too young, too male, you understand very clearly that you're not welcome there. This is a picture that I took at the site of the construction site before the construction was starting. I think this was 2006 or 2007. But what's interesting in this picture is, this again is the vision for what Amman is going to be. It's going to be this gleaming cosmopolitan city, and look at the kind of citizen. The woman, I think she's spraying herself with perfume, an expensive bag, paparazzi in the background. It's a very clear message of, who's invited to the party. Here is a picture of the new resort at the Hammamat Ma'in, which is south of Amman. This is an extraordinary hot springs that drains into the Dead Sea. It's incredibly beautiful. It was also a place that people would go and hike down the very steep cliffs and take your families on hot days and, hang out there. It is now, with one small part of it put aside, entirely a private space. It is a resort hotel and a spa. So the public is not now welcome to use this incredibly beautiful spot. A day pass, 3 years ago, I don't know how much it is now, a day pass to use the premises was about $90 US to have access to this site. Here again in Amman is another, one of these sort of nightclubby kind of spots. And so I think, the way I sort of put it is, Jordan is investing a vision of the future that is very much this cosmopolitan city, for a place. We're stable. If you look at the jordan.gov website, I think it says stable like 5 times on the first page. It's a stable regime with a stable economy, and it's secure and safe and stable. And it tells you that over and over. And the code is, of course, compared to other places in the region, we're so much better. So, that's unstable, but we're stable. So there's this explosion of these sort of very expensive cosmopolitan sites, very expensive clubs and bars, places that I can't possibly afford to go. You and I probably couldn't afford to go. Maybe some of you can. And again, you have to make a reservation in many of these places to go sit at the bar. And often you have to have a membership to be able to make a reservation. So there's layers and layers of exclusion here. And these are loud, visible sites. This is an open-air bar. These are loud. You see the lights and flashing and the partying. And across that is Ashrafiyya, Jebel Ashrafiyya, which is a very working-class neighborhood, seeing these sites of consumption and decadence and noise and partying and alcohol consumption. It's a very particular image for what Jordan can be. But in addition to cosmopolitanism, what do you have to have? You have to have your safe heritage, right? An authentic engagement with local Jordanians in a nice, safe environment. So here we have our lovely, handsome Bedouin pouring tea. You can come and have your nightclubs, but then you can engage with the locals. But this gentleman selling coffee is not what the regime has in mind. So as the sort of downtown Amman, which, Amman is a new city, a modern city, except for the, very little that had been there before, it doesn't have that romantic, souk, winding, bazaar kind of oriental look to it. And while the government isn't trying to build that, they've changed the zoning laws to exclude all these small businesses that have been there forever, very working class businesses, to get them out. So this tea guy has to go so you can have a nice tea shop where people can have argila and authentic tea with Jordanians. Right? This sort of used appliance store where you can buy gorgeous refurbished appliances, that all has to go and has to be displaced by, this authentic, romantic downtown image. So you have the gleaming new, this sort of heritage old, and all of its, creating spaces of exclusion. It's eliminating and excluding people from these processes. This is just another picture of downtown Amman, the Cliff Hotel, and these are the kind of tourist spaces that exist downtown. That's not the kind of tourism that the regime has in mind. This is an artist rendering of what it will look like. Again, it gives you that shiny, sparkly vision from a distance look. And this is the O Beach at the Dead Sea, one of these very expensive resorts. Again, you have to have a membership fee to get there. Club flyers, I just happened to pick these up last time I was there. All in English. They bring in DJs from all over the world. And there's many places that are loud, party, fun bars to go to. So what does this have to do about participation? I'm trying to argue that if we're thinking about participation in voting or starting a political party or running in elections or engaging in the economy in certain kinds of way, we're missing these spatial differentiations. We're missing these systematic modes of excluding. As was said earlier, certain kinds of participation are welcome and other kinds of participation are deemed not just unwelcome, but threatening. and they need to be controlled. But this exists in these images. The ones we're talking about are often parts of these visions, and we're not addressing the fact that they are parts of certain visions for economic development. And there are many other visions out there, many other visions for what the country could be, what the community could be, et cetera. And so I think if we attend to these sort of diverse visions, we can think about participation, we can think about exclusion in ways that help us understand who and what citizens are engaging, in what ways they're engaging, and in what ways they're excluded. So, we just had the Egyptian election where they extended the date to add more and more participation, but it's really not a real participation in any sense that's meaningful to the people. And so I want to sort of look at those processes. The reason I think this is crucial, and I'm going to stop because I don't want to, I want to leave time for discussion as well, and I have more examples I can give you if you want more empirical examples. But I think if we think seriously about the solutions side, what are the challenges and what are the solutions? We can't continue to imagine solutions, imagine participation, imagine alternatives in ways that starkly reproduce these kinds of very real exclusions that exist on a daily basis and affect people's lives. When your bus stop gets moved out of the city to build this project and you have to go around to get to a simple place, this isn't lost on anyone. And people know very clearly who's included and who's excluded in these visions, and most of the people, unfortunately, are excluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jillian. And now for the last speaker on the panel, Seif Dana, Professor Sociology and Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Trans-Arab Research Institute, the editorial board of the Arab Studies Quarterly, an advisor to the Palestinian policy network Al-Shabaka. Dana's specialization is sociological theory and global political economy. He researches and teaches on the Middle East, the Arab world, and Palestine, and has published many papers and book chapters on these topics. He contributes to Al Jazeera, both the Arabic and English sites, Al-Ahram Weekly, and Al-Akbar Arabic and English. He's currently writing a book on the Arab revolutions. Thank you.
Thank you. The thanks for the organizers for the invitation and having the chance to meet very interesting people here. It's 4 a.m. my time actually now, and I just had lunch and found out that I gave them the wrong file. So that's how we start. This paper actually began as a survey of the Israeli view of the Arab uprisings. My interest was to see what the Israelis say about the Arab uprisings, how they view them. So I was checking the Institute of National Security Studies of Tel Aviv University. I was following their annual publications, their journals, their memorandums, their daily and weekly publications. But I found out afterwards, after I looked at them at thousands and thousands of pages, that these publications inform us of an interesting story, a story that could actually tell us or help us understand the Israeli political mind, or more accurately, the Israeli political colonial mind. It could help us also conceptualize the Israeli-American relations, given the debate between the lobby doctrine and the power elite doctrine and other views. It also reminds us, sometimes when we forget, of the really deep and organic interrelationship between Western imperialism and colonial Zionism in Palestine. So there is a story to tell behind or underlying the Israeli literature regarding the Arab uprisings. But one of the most interesting things that actually the Israeli publications express is serious existential concerns. And these serious existential concerns, at least in the first 3 years, are expressed very clearly, given one important factor, and that's the decline of American power and the retreat of the American presence in the Middle East. And that, again, that's why I said it reminds us of this organic and deep interrelationship between Western imperialism and colonial Zionism in Palestine, and basically shows more clearly than ever, probably, in the Israeli literature this time, that what we've seen in Palestine since 1948 is nothing but a Western colonial venture that speaks in its name now. So what I have is now 3 surveys. The first one, I'm going to go through that very fast, regarding the decline of American power and decline of American hegemony, which I guess gave us somehow a space that enabled the Arab uprisings at some level. And then look at some of the headlines now, given that the idea of the American decline or the decline of American hegemony became basically a common theme. So it's not a matter of debate at this point. And the last part, which I will spend most of the time, hopefully, on it, is a review of the Israeli literature and conclude clearly all the statements that I've just made. I'd like to begin with a statement from President Nixon's speech in 1970. I can barely see that. 1970, after the US withdrew 150,000 American soldiers from Vietnam. And this is a very important date because many scholars actually date the decline of American power, or the beginning of the decline of American power, to that specific time. And interestingly, it coincides with another process, another global political economic process that actually contributes to the American decline, which is entering the second phase of what the world system theory calls the Continuities cycle, second phase of decline. The framework that I'm going to use basically is based on the world system theory, the Continuities cycle, which basically the lingo basically refers to a cycle of 50 to 70, roughly 50 to 75 year cycle that goes from that begins with an upward swing and economic expansion in the first phase, and in the second phase it's downward swing and economic contraction. But interestingly, this second phase, which began in the early 70s, late 60s, it depends on who you read, really, coincides with another process that Dr. Amin actually talked about significantly, the decline of the capitalist system, or the entering the terminal phase of the capitalist system. So that's actually the time where we're witnessing the American decline. The survey of both, again, journalism and scholarship shows that increasingly the idea of decline of American hegemony has become a common theme in the sense that it's not really contested anymore. In the summer of 2011, actually, that was the most of the articles of the publication for the Journal of the American Academy of Political Science. This is one issue of foreign affairs, the titles from one issue of the foreign affairs. I guess we can call it the voice of the establishment in the United States. They all talk about that as a given fact, but we will see actually evidence to support that. It's in a state of decline. So I'm going to skip through all these headlines, but basically, increasingly, there is no week that passes by without a new headline, a new article, a new study that confirms the same thing. And inform us of the end, or the beginning of the end, of what I would call the short American century. The short American century, a short century of hegemony that began in 1945, and it's very difficult to date, really, the end of the short American century. It never reached 100 years, of course. That's why it's a short century, just building on the idea of the long 16th century, the formation of the capitalist world system from 1450 to 1640. But I would actually make a claim now that we can date that to the end of August 2013, when the US, or at least the US strategy in the Middle East, obviously was defeated in Syria. That's that's the conclusion of most of these surveys, that the American century of hegemony is actually short, and we're witnessing the end of it. So we're dealing with a fading empire here, and that's very important because what structures, what has been structuring the international relations really, and the politics and the geopolitics of the world was actually the American posture in the world, the American presence in the Middle East, and the American hegemony. You know, most important scholars in the world actually talk about this. Maybe they're different in when it started. Noam Chomsky talks about that, basically says that the decline began in 1949 with the loss of China. Immanuel Wallerstein talks about the 1970s and relate that to the second phase of the counteractive cycle and the withdrawal from Vietnam, or the defeat in Vietnam. Samir Amin talks about the long decline, of course, relating that to the awakening of the people of the South. Of course, that's more about the capitalist system as a whole. Now, of course, in every stage, the U.S. had a counter strategy to deal with the decline. And the first phase, that began with Nixon, was actually what Wallerstein calls soft multilateralism. That lasted, or attempted to slow the decline, and lasted until Bush took over. And Bush decided, following the neoconservative advice, to follow unilateral policies, basically using force for the most part. And I would guess we can characterize what President Obama is doing at this point is organizing the decline at this point, a third strategy possibly. There are, of course, when we make the claim about an American decline or decline of American hegemony, or the fading of the American empire, there are many measures to look at. I would begin with something really that I thought of when I was coming here. I was reading Asia Times, and they were talking about the state of the American infrastructure, basically, and it reminded me with a statement that Michel Foucault made somewhere, that in the ruins of civilization, you can see the symptoms and the causes of the decline of that civilization. And in the US, you can see symptoms of the decline in the American infrastructure, from levees that have been failing, to dams, to airport infrastructure, to highways. Actually, in this coming August, the highway fund, the highway trust fund, is expected or projected to go bankrupt in the U.S. The American Civil Engineering, the Society of American Civil Engineers regularly have been rating the American infrastructure with D+. One of the most interesting things, actually, is that one of the achievements leading to the American hegemony was the construction of the railroad, intercontinental railroad in the U.S. At this point, actually, we can see an opposite image. While the world is entering the phase of high-speed rail, we can see that about 15,000 kilometers of that have been constructed in China. There is 0 kilometers of high-speed rail that have been constructed in the U.S. So you can look at any measure of decline, and you can see that it is declining. I could argue basically that we're witnessing a total decline, an economic decline that I will focus on for the most part, political decline, cultural decline, and I could add actually epistemological decline. Any careful reader of most publications will notice that there is a rise for native epistemology, which again signify the decline of the American power. But my focus, and I think that that's the factor that structures all these aspects of decline, is the political economic one, and that's basically the American contribution to the world production, which defines the hegemonic power, and the decline in the edge, or the losing the edge, essentially, that the U.S. enjoyed for a long time and gave the U.S. the status of the hegemonic power in the world system. Basically, this shows us that there has been a significant decline of the U.S. contribution to the global production. while the global production increased from 2003 to 2011 from 164 by 164%, it increased only 135% in the U.S. or the GDP. The increase in the U.S. GDP increased by 135%. The last from 1960, almost 6,000%. The global production increased by almost 6,000%. It increased less than 3,000 in the U.S. So there has been a decline. I have the details for that. I'm going to keep going. That's just showing the decline of the American contribution to the world production by year, by every 10 years. This shows the increase in the global production versus the increase in the U.S. GDP. And it shows that basically, I will show you the numbers. This is entering China or including China in the picture. I'm rushing here just because I'm looking at the time. We see that it's, because I want to characterize the process, it's structural, and when it's structural, there is very little that can be done about it. It's relative. It means that there are other forces and other countries entering the process, and in this case, China. The contribution of the Chinese contribution to the global production has been increasing significantly at a faster rate than that of the increase in the global production. So their contribution has been increasing while the U.S.'s contribution has been declining. That's just a display. Basically, the U.S. from 2003 to 2011, the U.S. GDP increased from about $11 trillion to less than 16, while the world production increased from almost $35 trillion to 70, almost doubled, while the U.S. increase was less than 25%. But to end the speculation about that, we'll just go to a publication by the American National Intelligence. I'm sure most of you are aware of this. The Global Trends is a 5-year publication that is issued by the American National Intelligence. And basically, this is what they say about the world in 2030. There will be radically different. It will be radically transformed. By 2030, no country, whether the US, China, or any other large country, will be a hegemonic power. That's the assessment of the American National Intelligence. Of course, they have 4 scenarios for how the world would look like in 2030. And I could actually argue that we can actually talk about other scenarios. But essentially, there is no room for speculation anymore. That are we entering, and is it a transitional phase that we're living? Is the US power declining or not? It is. The last one, because I don't want to look like I'm focusing only on the economic aspect. This is the the Global Power Index that includes the population size, military spending, and technology, and of course the GDP. This is a display. What we will see is an increase in the global power of China. Really? It says 12 there. Is that wrong? Oh. Okay, so by any measure, we have a decline. Can keep going forever. Okay, so the literature, the Israeli literature. Basically, what I was looking at is the Herzliya assessment, which is the most important security gathering in Israel that is held every year. Herzliya, the documents Herzliya 2010, 2011, 2013, and 2014, which will be held in June, but they have a preliminary program that we can look at, and I'm gonna take you to some of the headlines that they say. This is Herzliya 2012. This is the lingo they use. This is the language. Profound strategic uncertainty. That's the 21st century to them. These are some of the titles of the papers from Herzliya 2011. Reshuffling the deck of global influence and resources, shifting global balance of power, shifting sands in the Middle East, the diminishing posture of the US in the Middle East, facing the game changers. These are, because I don't want to miss that with the time, these are the main themes that run throughout all the Israeli documents from Herzliya from 2010 until 2014. All the journals that are published by the Institute of National Security, the centrality of American hegemony to the existence of Israel, the centrality of the American Middle East strategy, again to the existence of Israel, Israel's regional status, that's a concern, and another concern is the regional balance of power, where the US presence also plays a significant role. And that's why I said it reminds us always of this organic relationship between Western imperialism and colonial Zionism. One of the interesting things about that is they also confirm the idea of decline of the US, commenting actually on the third and last presidential debate between Obama and Romney. The head of the institute published an article, and it was basically using for the first time from the Israeli standpoint that we are witnessing a different America. Of course, a different America doesn't mean that America is going to abandon Israel at this point, but it is going to be different. They will continue to support Israel in many ways, but possibly will not fight on Israel's behalf as they've been doing for some time. The trend for the United States, that's their assessment, is to distance itself from the problems of the Middle East. That's their assessment of the Obama performance. I'm going to keep going because I don't have time, but this is why American decline is so significant to the Israelis. Because according to the Minister of Strategic Affairs, the US is one of the most important aspects of Israel's national security. Not only that, the US is the most important component. The US-Israeli alliance is a building block of Israel's national security. That's Herzliya 2012. A strong US in the Middle East is a vital strategic interest of Israel. Again, confirming the same thing. Excuse me. And most significantly, this is their conclusion. At this point, there is no of course, it's changing now. That's not. There is no alternative to the U.S. Let me look for it. Okay, I have the survey and the other aspect. So it's an important building block of Israel's national security. There is no alternative to the strong American presence in the Middle East. They cannot. Russia will not fill the vacuum if they choose to be allies with Russia. Additionally, an additional factor that entered the discussion in Israel with 2010 actually was the idea that one cannot escape the impression that the U.S. considers, or at least some forces in the U.S. consider Israel a strategic risk at this time rather than a strategic asset. And that was, of course, after General David Petraeus' testimony before the U.S. Senate Armed Forces, in which he actually argued that Israel's criminal behavior actually constitutes a threat to the American soldiers in the region. Israel will be isolated. Again, that's one of them. I'm going to end with their last commentaries. On Egypt and Russia MiG-35 fighter jet deals. Basically, that's actually just appeared just a few days ago. They basically say that if the arms deal between Egypt and Russia is completed, and they're talking about the MiG-35, it will it will represent a significant event in the Middle East strategic picture, another sign of reduced United States involvement in the region. For Russia, this will be a meaningful strategic achievement in its global struggle against the West. I could go on and on. I have about 120 slides of statements of the same thing. But I will make an inference, and you can meet me in 20 to 30 years and say I was right or I was wrong, that any careful reading, actually, of the Israeli literature that gave us the Israeli political mind naked to study and explore, would have to conclude that the area, the geographic area that we know between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River in 20 to 30 years will be called Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the cooperation of all the speakers. We have a fair bit of time for discussion till we break at 4:45. So what I would request the participants is to, if possible, limit yourself to one question. If that is impossible, then at least limit yourself to one question for each participant, not more than that, and to a maximum of 2. And I'm excluding the comments. So maybe what I'll do is, would you prefer to collect maybe a group of questions and then go ahead? Okay, then maybe we have the hands first. Yeah, sure.
Hello. My name is Rami Zurek. I have a question essentially for Fadhel. Fadhel, you mentioned the need for a food policy, and you quoted the issue of food imports versus food export, and you alluded to a big food import bill in Tunisia specifically. I just wanted to make one point clear. The rate, the food trade balance in Tunisia for 2013 was 87%. That's pretty good. And the food import from the total import is just 10%. Now, your big problem in Tunisia is, in fact, the manufactured, which is 72%. It's not even the energy. And so how would the community-based activity, how is it going to deal with your deficit in the balance of trade that is essentially manufactured products? And Jillian, I just have one comment, if you allow me to use your first name, which is, I agree with very much of what you said, knowing Jordan, but I am amazed that you could actually give us half an hour talk without using the word class one single time. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe the next question, please.
Thank you. My name is Ray Bush. There's a conference in itself just from the panel that we've heard. A fantastic series of presentations. 2 kind of broad-based questions, really. One to the first 2 and then one to Seif. And in relation to the first 2, I'm wondering whether what has been traced, partly in this session and also in the one before, is that the advantages of the type of struggle and protest that delivered the uprisings is also its biggest drawback, namely a certain degree of kind of unorganized everyday struggles, as Asif Bayat would have called them, everyday struggles of the ordinary that led to the uprisings. And here I think definitions are important. I disagreed with a lot of what came out of the first session this morning in the sense that I think we're not talking about revolutions. We are talking about uprisings, and we shouldn't use spring. I welcome the fact that Arab Spring is in inverted commas, because it's patronizing, it's ahistorical and apolitical, and most of the literature has been generated by Western political scientists in the mainstream that I think is very disconcerting. If the advantage of the uprisings was that they were unorganized and led to a toppling of the regime, they were not a revolution because it was not class-based, there wasn't a political agenda, And that's, as Tariq Ali has said very famously, for a revolution, you need more than just a volume of people in the street. You need an agenda of social change and social transformation. And that hasn't been forthcoming. It has not been forthcoming anywhere, actually. And I'm wondering if the advantage then of the mobilization to get rid of the regime leaders has now become a bit of a drag on a reconstruction in the sense of facilitating an agenda that's radical and transformatory. Because, Fadhel, you have a fantastic agenda for political change. But it's almost like, you know better than me, the Americans would say it's like apple pie and motherhood. You can't possibly be against it. Can't possibly be against anything that you said. But of course, everything that you said has a class agenda underpinning it and the need to attack and transform existing hegemonic forms of power. Finally, the last comment to Seif, fantastic presentation, but worries the hell out of me. Worries the hell out of me. Worries. Not that you conclude in 30 years there will be Palestine, a unified state, but that we know that regimes in decline and hegemonic forces in decline are at their most dangerous. And I wonder what, without you adopting a glass ball type of policy analysis, I wonder what projection you have from your analysis suggests the type of strategy that Israel may seek to develop in terms of sustaining its existing hegemonic force.
Thank you. The next one, please.
Alfredo Sadfilio from the University of London. Two quick comments. One to Seif. I think in a world of transnational production networks instead of isolated nation states, I think it is problematic to use GDP statistics to measure national welfare or national power. And in the case of the United States in particular, I think this is a difficult trick. I don't disagree with your conclusions. I'm just pointing out that I think the method to get there is perhaps problematic. US transnational corporations have a worldwide dominance in a whole range of fields, from software design to aerospace to microelectronics, and they have reaffirmed this despite the decline in US share of global GDP. So can we do better than this? Perhaps by looking at transnational corporations themselves and how they operate globally. To Fadhel, very quickly, experiences in Latin America in particular, focusing on your employment program, experiences in Latin America in particular have shown the importance of linking up social welfare policies with industrial policies. Can you develop that angle a little bit of your presentation? I'd be grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess, okay, the last one for the first round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since I only have one question to ask, I'm going to direct it to Seif. I had other questions, but I'll direct my question to Seif. Seif, this decline in American power and therefore the decline in Israeli regional power and the fear that ultimately we're going to have Palestine. My question is, if this is so, if this is Israeli thinking, strategic thinking, how come so far they have not come to some kind of an accepted agreement with the rest of the Arab world? Secondly, what is this conclusion of yours? How does it bear on the Arab uprisings? Is Israel's interest, you think, not to support the Arab uprisings and not to have a more democratic Middle East and not to accept any kind of solution except that they have all of Palestine? I mean, in our own work, we found a fundamental reason why is it that the Arab world never democratized, at least until now, is the fact that you have never resolved the Palestinian issue among other conflicts in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with that, we'll just ask the panelists to respond to the questions that we have received till now, maybe. Fadhel, if you'd go first.
Thank you. Oh, thank you all for the questions. With regard to the first question about food policy, the food import deficit in Tunisia, in the context of a structural trade deficit, in the context of an external debt that's hovering around 100% of
export revenues annually, any little deficit you have, it's still a burden, and it's not good enough. So 87%, it's still not sufficient. So there's still need to focus on that particular gap as a long-term solution. You can't constantly rely on, export-led growth and tourism and all of these external, very, uncertain factors, especially in these times when, economic growth in Europe, which is the main trading partner, is tanking and, furthering the difficulties for a country like Tunisia. With regards to manufacturing, it's absolutely right. I mean, when you opened up the economy in the 1970s in Tunisia, and the industrial structure wasn't ready in the same way as, for example, the Korean economy was ready to compete internationally with the Japanese economy, you've set yourself in this trap where you're constantly importing intermediate goods to keep your manufacturing industry going. And that's essentially the same problem that's persisted since the 1970s. So that's a structural problem that's not going to go away unless somehow you revamp your manufacturing sector to close that gap and actually become a fully integrated domestic industrial system, manufacturing system that can take benefit of that export-led growth. So those are, and I didn't mention it in the presentation, but in my work I make it very clear that this job guarantee program is not a silver bullet solution, but it has to be the base upon which you build and address all of these structural deficiencies in a multifaceted way. So you need agricultural policy, manufacturing policy, trade policy, as short-term and long-term strategies to regain financial sovereignty and to escape that trap that's been set up since the 1970s. With regards to the second question on, and I'm trying to gather my thoughts here. It's also 4 a.m. for me. So the question, I think, was about the fact that there is no agenda for social and economic transformation in Tunisia, if I remember correctly. Is that? Yeah. It's just that I don't remember the part of the question. I have the. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm. Yep. Oh, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And in the case of Tunisia, the fact that it was kind of a leaderless movement, so to speak, quote-unquote leaderless movement, makes it difficult to generate a strategic agenda, alternative agenda. And what I've observed in Tunisia in particular is there's very intense discussions about constitutional reform and the role of women and religion. All of these discussions are important and healthy in the process of this transition, but the lack of conversation about the economic strategy and the dominance of the mainstream policies of export-led growth, more FDI, let's try to market Tunisia better to the West, is so prevalent in the right and the center and the left, with the Islamists, with the Salafists, with anybody you talk to. That's the only option that's dominating the discussion. And I think that's the troubling part, that even the so-called progressive forces have no economic agenda, alternative economic agenda. And the same thing in Egypt with Sisi and Sabahi, and for the most part. In Egypt, the political forces and the voices that had alternative economic strategies were excluded and silenced and marginalized. And that's the tragedy, I think, in the Egyptian uprisings, I believe. I'm going to pass the mic to my other colleagues. I know there's one more question, but in the interest of time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for great comments. The first gentleman, I didn't get your name. What is it? Rami. Yeah, I've thought a lot about class, and there's a reason I don't use it, although obviously this is a story of class. The reason I don't use it is because I think when you use it in the context of this project, it's too easy to conclude that the working lower class are excluded and the rich enter into part of this. And if you think about different visions for what Jordan or the future could be, you have sometimes middle class or upper middle class that are wealthy but very pious that reject this vision and share a different kind of vision. And likewise, among the lower classes, you have a chunk of the population that loves these projects. They just want access to them. And you have a chunk of the lower class that hates these projects. So it's clearly a story of class, but I'm trying to sort of parse it out differently in terms of those exclusions and exclusions. And for Ray, if I may, I completely agree they're not revolutions. I use the word uprisings. I think Egypt is probably best described as an uprising with a coup. And I'm not talking about 2013. I'm talking about, January 25th. But I also agree. I study social movements, and then I spend the whole first chapter of my book critiquing social movement literature. So I'm not a fan of it. But it does point exactly to your point that sort of after these moments of possibility, you see the institutionalized powers, whether they're economic or political, scrambling to hold on to whatever they can hold on to. And the groups that don't have a coherent, organized agenda are simply going to be lost. I was in Egypt not long after, a few months after, early in 2011, and a friend, since I was doing this project, she was talking about all these sort of massive skyscraper projects that were frozen, they're halted. Everything's just stopped, and the bulldozers are there, and she says, when those start up again, we'll know the revolution's lost. And it's an interesting way to look at what does or doesn't change. And so there's this bait and switch where you have this moment, imagined moment of something different, and then you have, let's focus on the electoral procedures, don't worry about all this, let's focus on these issues. And I think you're really right. I had this in my comment, and I didn't, in my notes, but I didn't, I skipped right over it. These are ongoing processes, as you point out. The revolution, they're not revolutions, they're not over. The Arab Spring isn't something we're really at the after point yet. And I'm not just talking about Syria and Libya and Yemen, but I'm talking also about Egypt and Tunisia, and I'm talking about places like Jordan that have felt it in very serious ways, and that's ongoing. And I think we sort of adjust our temporal sight in ways that I think would be really productive. But I thank you for your comments.
It's on? Okay. Okay, I'll start with the first question about the Israeli strategy. And I think after reviewing all the literature, it basically says that the U.S. is the most important building block of Israel's national security. All the documents that I looked at, and I'm talking about thousands and thousands of pages from journals, the Herzliya assessment from 2010 until 2013, and of course I looked at the program of 2014, which is supposed to be held in June. You never find any expression of existential concern, actually anywhere in the world, let alone in Israel, except in these documents. But of course, probably because of the unique nature of Israel as a colonial venture in the 21st century. And they actually talk about that in Herzliya 2011. They talk about what are the strategies that are out there. Basically, they say there is no alternative to the U.S., to a strong U.S. presence in the Middle East. And any decline in the U.S. presence and U.S. global hegemony actually will necessarily reflect and heavily reflect on Israel's security, according to them. And there is only one recommendation that is repeated over and over again in almost all of these assessments. And I'm going to read that from Herzliya 2011. I didn't have the time actually to talk about that. But basically they say the U.S. cannot be passive, and they ought to share the burden. I mean, they're talking about the allies of the U.S., Israel, and what they characterize as the moderate Arab states. They ought to share the burden of revitalizing the U.S.-led coalition of moderate Arab forces and, of course, and Israel in the region by jointly promoting the peace process. So more over and over again, the authors of these documents call for negotiations with the Palestinians and reaching some sort of settlement because they think ending what they characterize as the Arab-Israeli conflict, struggle, as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, would actually enhance the posture of the U.S. in the region. And they call on their government over and over again from 2011 at least to 2013 to actually do that, which actually begs the explanation, why didn't the government do that? Since there is no alternative to the U.S. The U.S. is in a state of decline, and that would necessarily reflect on Israel. I guess it's very similar to the shift that actually took place in the U.S. strategy to face the decline from soft multilateralism adopted from Nixon until Clinton, basically a combination of factors to slow the decline of the American hegemony, to be broken, of course, by Bush with unilateral policies using force primarily, which actually backfired. Instead of slowing the decline, it accelerated the American decline since 2000 and afterwards. So there is no strategy in Israel actually accepting this help revitalize the U.S. presence in the Middle East, do anything possible that could actually keep the U.S. presence in the Middle East longer and longer. And I guess anybody, again, if carefully reading these documents written by some of Israel's most supposedly eloquent strategic thinkers, I don't know what strategic thinkers mean here, but anyway, and security minds, it shows that there is a realization here that we are dealing with a colonial venture of a special kind, of course, and it's going to come to an end at some point. All what they can do is lengthen the time of this project, this colonial project in the region. There is no other alternative, and the fact that they stress the Israeli-American relation in this way shows that Israel is just an extension of Western imperialism, and the state of Western imperialism, in particular American imperialism, would necessarily reflect on the state in the Middle East and would reflect necessarily on Israel. As for the second question, I totally agree, and what I said basically is there are many indicators. I could have just focused as an example on the state of the infrastructure in the U.S. I could have just looked at the revenues, the decline in revenues collected by the government annually. I could have looked at many factors, and I said this is just one example that shows, that signify actually the decline. But my conception is basically we're dealing is based on an assumption that when we deal with imperialism, we're dealing with a total reality that is everywhere. I could have just focused on really native epistemology, or the rise of native epistemology, to show the decline in the Eurocentric scholarship, or at least Eurocentric epistemology. I could look at any of these factors. So what I did is actually just selected the easier way out, but actually I included other factors, but out of 120 slides, and given the decline in time from 35 minutes to 25 minutes, I didn't have the time to do that. But essentially, yeah, I agree with you. I could have included that as a factor. Why Israel did not accept an agreement, and Israel's view of the Arab uprisings. Again, Samir, these documents clearly show that the Israeli security politicians or strategic thinkers or security thinkers were expressing serious existential concerns with the beginning of the uprising. They didn't take Tunisia seriously because they did not think that it will extend. But the moment it started happening in Egypt, it was obvious in the documents again that Israel and Saudi Arabia were actually very angry at the U.S., the way the U.S. behaved in regards to Egypt. Although at the beginning the U.S. did not really support the uprising in Egypt, and they tried to support Mubarak, as Hillary Clinton's famous statement actually in the first few days. But after it was obvious that he was going to be ousted, so they took a different position. But the Israelis showed really serious concern about any change in the Arab world. But they did not stop there, though. They did not stop there. That a change in the Arab world is a serious danger, especially in the revolutionary sense, especially in the democratic sense, is seen by Israel as a serious challenge to them. Not only that, it did actually, especially with the events in Egypt, started to change the world's perception of the Arabs. deconstructing all these racist and Orientalist views of the Arabs. But they started another strategy, which is actually trying to steer away the uprisings from their original purpose. And I guess there is a thing to say here that when I did a survey of the Western media, how they commented on the Arab uprisings, and what we see is a totally different narrative of the revolutions. Actually, it's the narrative of counter-revolutions and the narrative of the neoliberal forces that replaced socio-economic demands of the people in the beginning with neoliberal democracy, or the idea of neoliberal democracy. So Israel participated significantly in actually trying to steer away the revolution, at least through the narrative. And in Syria particularly, they participated actually on the ground. They participated in almost every aspect in Syria. But what I want to say in Syria, as an example, Syria was the only country, basically, they were interested in the collapse of the regime, or the disintegration of or the fall of the regime, for one purpose. Although some people said that if Al-Qaeda and Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra take over, that will constitute a serious threat. And they said, we can deal with this. That's the analysis of the Israel Institute of National Security, that we can deal with this as long as we can break the alliance between Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. If we can break, that constitutes the real threat to Israel, according to them. So it's a price worth paying to support those in Syria against Assad, despite what they might think of Israel. So I think Israel has been playing a very significant role. At least that's what their documents show, in what we call now, or what we have been calling since day one, actually, counter-revolutions, and not only in terms of narrative, not only in terms of supporting certain forces, especially in Syria. They played a significant role in Syria and in Egypt and in other parts of the Arab world. Why didn't they sign an agreement and listen to their strategic thinkers? I don't know. I think until now, what we can see is what dominates Israel, aside from the fact that the Israeli political system doesn't allow for, if you want to be pragmatic, doesn't allow for that, given the nature of coalitions and formation of governments. But I think Israel is still dominated by this, ideological Zionism, which doesn't recognize, they're engaged in the political process, or what's called the political process, just as a cover-up for their settlement activities and daily criminal activities, really. So I don't think they're engaged because they're serious or they have a peace strategy or political strategy. And there is no room in the Israeli, at least ideological Zionist mind for any sort of political settlement. So people who believe that, I think, just believe in an illusion. Why I said what I said about the conclusion, I think essentially we're dealing, as I said, with a global structural process that is leading up to the decline of American hegemony, the most important component of Israel's national security. And it's a structural process. It cannot be undone. It's a matter of history. And capitalism is a historical system. It's not, so it's going to go through these crises, and the hegemonic power will be replaced, or the global system will change. And we're actually living a transitional period in which we're witnessing the formation of a new global system, a new world order, and that will not be for at least that's the way I see it, in the interest of Israel. The Global Power Index basically showed that there is a decline in the Western influence. There will be a significant decline in Western power and Western influence. And given the fact that at least even serious Israeli sociologists, and I'm a sociologist, I follow what they write, basically see Israel as a colonial project, and a Western extension, and they talk about this organic and deep interrelationship between Western imperialism and the colonial Zionism in Palestine. I think any decline, any weakness in the Western powers would lead to significant implications on the Israeli side. But that cannot be, of course, will remain an illusion if we can just only wait for that to happen without any Arab intervention. And the last conclusion that I didn't have the time to say, that the Arab uprisings actually, and the failure of the Arab uprisings, I can conclude that one of the reasons was ignoring or marginalizing the question of Palestine, and that was a misunderstanding of the nature of the problems they're having and the extension on the nature of these problems. But my conclusion is the Arab uprisings, the fact that they took place and the fact that they failed, ignoring the disintegration of the region caused by the Sykes-Picot agreement, at least, means basically that the Palestine question is not a Palestinian question only, it's an Arab question primarily. Of course, we all know it's a human question at this point, given the nature of Israel's crime and its apartheid practices. But it confirms for the first time that the formation or the supporting the foundation of the state of Israel in the region was meant to block an Arab unity and the integration of the Arab region, which I think is the only solution for, or at least an important step in the solution for most of the problems that that Arab people face. That's it.
Well, we really don't have time for many more questions, thanks to the detailed discussions and responses that we have had. But I spotted one hand over there, and I also have to give Fadhel time for one unanswered question. So if you could be brief.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Chadomir Nestorovic. I'm a professor at the ESSEC Business School here in Singapore, and my question is for Seif. Because the question of the American decline has been debated for a very long time, and for the sake of the argument, I will take the opposite view, if you don't mind. The opposite view, I will quote, in fact, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, who last week in Tokyo made a very interesting statement concerning the scenario here in Asia, and he said that America is not a nation in decline, and that America is the dominant power in the Pacific, and it will stay the dominant power in the Pacific for the next decades. The main reason for that is the versatility and the extraordinary capacity of resilience of the United States facing any kind of challenge. So my question is, how can we explain that for the same topic, that is American power, we may have completely different points of view? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. So Fadhel, if you could go first, and then maybe Seif can have the last word.
Yeah, very briefly, on the question of linking the employment program to industrial policy, as I described in my presentation very briefly, that this is not a kind of a macro employment program, kind of cookie cutter approach. It really has to be designed area by area in a strategic way, looking at the long-term structural deficits that the country faces. So for example, in terms of industrial policy, if you have a manufacturing sector that's constantly importing intermediate goods, trying to create a trade surplus, but constantly failing in that process, then you have to really look at what the problems are. If it's a skills issue, then you design employment programs that create transferable skills that allow you over time to enhance and plug that gap. If it's a technological issue, then you have to focus on education, vocational training, international cooperation to target those strategic problems. So not everything will be local, village, community-based employment things. There are certain things that require the large-scale intervention of mainline government intervention. Not everything will be community-based again. So, for example, in places like Algeria and places like Saudi Arabia, where you have housing crisis and young people in their 20s into their 30s with no employment, no vocational skills, no hope for anytime soon having their own apartment, a decent job, middle-class status, getting married. All of these things are tremendously paralyzing issues in North Africa in particular. They look like problems, but at the same time, we have to be creative and look at solutions, short-term and long-term solutions. So for example, if you, as a government, put in place a program that guarantees that by the time you're 25, you are guaranteed a skilled profession and owning your own house. If, for example, you create a parallel program or a vocational training program that goes through middle school and high school, weekend or evening, or just mainline vocational training says, you're going to be trained in this particular profession. We guarantee you an employment position or an internship or a mentorship position after you graduate with major construction companies. And by the time you pay your dues and work 4 or 5 years for a particular program, you build your own house and you have your own house. You already have middle class status. You have home ownership. You have skills and you have transferable skills to start your own company or to move on to another profession or whatever it is. These are the kind of strategies that we have to put in place. But again, as I said earlier, we're at a very vulnerable time for Middle Eastern populations for any kind of bold action where the government is saying, we're going to guarantee a 10-year plan for 20 million people. That's often viewed as a slippery slope to some sort of dictatorial decisions. Unfortunately, the political leadership that we have at this point doesn't have the political mandate yet to take those bold actions. In the meanwhile, we're doing more of the same. We're going to stick with the same export-oriented policies, with the same foreign direct investment. Let's hope more tourists will show up. All kinds of, there is no alternative approach. The thing is, there are creative solutions out there. They're just not on the table, unfortunately, so far. But we're working on it.
Thank you. So, Seif, the last word to you.
Thank you. I would actually like to, if you can Google John Kerry's statements regarding the war on Syria before August 30th and after. He was a hawk, and he was acting as the Secretary of State of a hegemonic power, that this is what we want and this is what Syria should do. 2 days later, after August 30th, he was acting like the Secretary of State of a third world country, the way he was talking. So even the US is trying to capitalize on past hegemony and past power. Now, why do we have these different opinions? I think they're everywhere, but in the US, there is a consensus on that amongst even, well, that's why I showed the one issue of foreign affairs, which is the voice of the establishment, essentially, talking about what should we do in this case. That is, we are going through a state of decline, and what we should do is have a strategy to deal with it, either slow it or adjust to a new world order or something of that sort. But they're not denying it. But what I do is I can't speak as a politician. If I am a politician, I could speak as a politician, but I'm not. I hope what I was trying is actually to present surveys from scholarship that confirm this, from journalism that confirms this. But let me end with this, because the issue of the Asia pivot, the new strategy, the shift to Asia, actually it turns out after all this hubris about the idea of leaving the Middle East, at least in part, and moving to Asia. A couple of months ago, there was a hearing in the US Senate with some generals from the American Military Command. And basically they said, that's what I conclude, that we have two pivots, really, two Asia pivots. One, the declared one, that we are going to move 60% of the American Navy to Asia, facing China and parts of Russia to contain them, etc. That's declared. We have the power to do this. But the military generals said no. The capabilities we have cannot achieve this purpose. So we have two pivots, really, a declared one and actually a realistic one that could be done, which is not what the media is talking about. Because, again, in the media, they're talking about the Asia pivot, the American strategy in Asia, as if the US is still back in the climax of its hegemony. And that's not the case. And that's what the American military generals are saying, that the goals of the Asia pivot cannot be achieved. We don't have the revenues. We don't have the abilities to do that, to achieve that. And add to this, the latest budget that was actually discussed in the U.S. Senate in February, just in this past February, there is a significant decline. And this is the context within which those generals were commenting on the Asia pivot, that there is a decline in the American military, there will be a decline in the American military expenditure in this year from 4.7% of the total budget to less than 3%. There will be a decline in the number of active servicemen. There will be a decline in almost every aspect of the military. So that will necessarily have political implications on the US strategies, not only in Asia, but even in the Middle East. So we can follow the media, and we can follow the actual data and actual numbers and read them and see what they say to us. So I guess I can end with the fact that the US is in a state of decline. We entered the end of really a short American century, and I'm calling it a short American century because by the standards of empires, or as far as empires go, as far as hegemonic powers go, the US was the most probably powerful, the most significant, and had the most, had the edge that no other empire enjoyed before, but they had the lowest, the shortest time as a hegemonic power. It didn't reach really a century. That's it. Thank you.
Note, maybe please join me in thanking our three panelists for excellent presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our chairperson and panelists. We will now go for a short coffee break at the dining hall, and we will re-adjourn here at 5 for the third panel. I have just a short note to let all of you know. The book that was launched just now is available for purchase outside at a booth at a discounted price of $90. It's retailing at $120. So, yeah, thank you.